how to get drums to punch through a mix. Nick Launay has several tips for this specific purpose. Doesn't matter what genre you're working in, you're probably going to want to know some of these just to be able to visualize the drums differently in how you may work while you're mixing to get more out of them. If you're not familiar with Nick Launay, he's worked with the Yeah Yeah Yeahs, Arcade Fire, Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds, the band Idols, Black Rebel Motorcycle Club. The guy's list goes on and on and on. Check his discography out when you're done with this. But let's, at the moment, just give you some basic stuff that he's doing, and it might shed some light on other things. Now, if you're using real drums, your first step has always got to be to gate the drums, because that way you won't have hi-hat bleed. You won't have snare drum bleed in your kick mic. You know, that's critical stuff. So the first two things he's doing, he's got two mics on the kick. So if you just have samples or something and you have no bleed, you can eliminate the gate, which is the first step, but the other stuff still might apply. So check this out. His kick in, that's the mic in his kick drum, is an M88. His kick out is a D112. Very popular kick mics. So he's gating. Now, when you're gating, just to give you basics on this stuff, he's really fast, the microsecond level, like as fast as it goes on the attack. And you control the release based on how long do you want the sound to hold. And that's the same thing with the hold. You basically use the hold and the release to control how long the sound lingers for before it gets gated. Now, the range, if you keep it pretty hot, it's like, which would be in this section, you're basically going from quiet to sound, as opposed to like a little difference between sound and quiet. This is basically silence to sound. Now, looking at this part, the side chain, you would want some high frequency roll off. You see this part right here? When you don't have it keyed to anything, it's just using its own sound as the key. By rolling off some highs, what you're essentially doing is keeping that part out of the gate. So if you want your snare or your kick or anything to sound more natural, you may not want it to also gate those frequencies. So for example, the hi-hat bleeding, if you want to keep that sounding more natural, turn this on and roll off, everything above a certain number, and then you'll keep the hi-hat. Like for example, on snare, a lot of times I'll do that, and when we get to snare, you'll see a similar thing. But the snare parallel, rolling off everything above, 900 hertz. So at 1K above is intact, which will allow you to hear the hi-hat more naturally rather than having the hi-hat sound gated. So when you're dealing with a kick-in mic, it's usually less of a problem, so you can you don't have to worry about keeping this so tight, but your sound, you may have a lot of bleed on your kick drum mic. So look at it in terms of why you're doing it and not really the exact settings for this, and then you can determine whether you want to use it or not. So moving on, you're gating both the kick in and kick out. So just for all intents and purposes, similar settings on both, even though in your case, you may need more or less of a gate. You want the sound to hold more, a little more hold, a little more release on either kick in or kick out. Now, after the gate, this will apply to other samples as well as real drum sounds. This is what he's doing on his EQ. Now, check this out. I find a lot of people, right, especially when you're dealing with real drums or something like that, how many people do you know that would roll off like everything south of 58 with a high-pass filter at 24 dB per octave on a kick drum? Not that many, probably. But he's also creating a resonance. Now, this is something that you could do on a few different plugins. I just like the way it's so clear on this plugin, and he uses it on this plugin. Typical stock EQ, because the guy's old school, so he's been using this forever, so this is his thing. But by basically turning it to, so you see these modes, when you're on the shelf kind of thing, you can't do it. But when you're on this mode over here to the left of the shelf, which is the bell curve, when you're on that, you can boost like crazy. You see this boost here? And then you turn the Q up to 10, and now all of a sudden you see this resonance. What this creates is the ability to add a note to the kick drum. Now that note, as you move this changes pitch. So it goes from, boom, 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 boom. It keeps getting higher pitched as you slide it up. So you want to put that to fit with the song. So and also by boosting 14 dB, like a lot, you can really wind up giving way more body to this sound. Now, he's also doing other boosts here, 5 dB around 100 hertz, 4.5 dB around 1K, and he's rolling off a little bit of the top above 12.5K. All right, but that's the kick-in mic. So keeping this in mind, and again, the exact frequencies should not be what you're looking at. It should more be this concept. Rolling off low end is super okay when you're going to also create this resonance of a tons of low end. And check this out. So that's the kick in. On the kick out, same thing. We got a gate, right? But he's got, on the kick out mic, he's boosting a ton. He's boosting 4 at 50 hertz. So plus 4 dB, 50 hertz. It's not exactly dB, I believe, but it's close. So 4 dB, 50 hertz. 400 hertz, he's boosting like 9 dB. Okay. Then he's boosting at 5K, 6 dB. So the guy's putting a lot of mid-range into this sound because he really wants it to cut through. He also had a boost around 5K on this kick-in mic because if you notice over here, he's not boosting anything up here. So he's only doing it over there. In my opinion, could you do it here? Maybe, but he probably had this all locked in a way he wanted, so he didn't then want to go in and mess with it. So he just slapped another EQ on it and, boosted some 5K. But then when you look at the API, because he's boosting 5K here, it's creating a very similar thing. So he didn't feel the need to put a Pro Q3 on here and boost the same exact thing. That was good enough for him. Now, again, he's a dude, like you'll hear a lot of people be like, little here, little there, little here, little there. I say it a lot too, little here, little there. Notice how much he boosts. The guy is a fan of doing what you need to make it happen. And that's another school of thought. Sometimes it needs this. Sometimes it's little here, little there. There's not one size fits all for mixing. So the next thing he does that's very cool and unique and I think is amazing, he'll send to a Sans amp. He actually does it from the kick in on the mix I saw him working on. So he's taking it from the kick in, which would be this M88, and he'll send to the Sans amp. Now on the Sans amp track, so in other words, just full on 0.0, and he even has it in pre-fader, which means no matter what you do to this fader, doesn't matter. This is always going to get here the same. You lower this all the way. It doesn't matter. This will always get to the Sans amp track the same. That's why he has it set to pre-fader, because he probably, no matter what he does, he wants to be able to control the levels separately. That's how you would look at that. You don't want lowering this to affect how loud this is. You go pre. All right, use the pre-fader on this thing up here. You select that blue jam. Now, on the Sans amp track, this was critical. He's got to gate this track. Now, because if you don't gate a track that you wind up distorting, you wind up having distortion on your all sorts of other stuff. Anything bleeding will now be distorted, and then it just winds up ruining the sound. So you want the cleanest kind of sound possible on just the kick. You're gating just like we would do with the other things. Very short attack down here, okay? And then mess with your release, mess with your hold to make the sound longer, right? Ratio somewhere in this neighborhood. Now, again, every song could require something different, but just for a starting point, 30 to 2 to 1. So this is where we're at. This is what it looks like. And it also rolling off everything above 900 hertz, like I mentioned originally. That will make it where the hi-hat stays out of this, so you keep original sounding hi-hat rather than hi-hat that sounds gated, because that has a different sound. You hit it with a Sans amp. Now, how much distortion? You could crank the preamp to get more distortion. You could also mess with all these controls. If people know me, they know this is one of my favorite plugins, and it's no coincidence that it's probably everyone's favorite plugin because it just does so much to the sound. So if you want more low end, you turn this up. Now, all of a sudden, you got a ton more low end, probably more than you could ever want. It's really amazing what this can do to a sound. So mess with SansAmp on its own track so you can blend it in, right? And instead of even sending it here, if you wanted, you could just duplicate this track and put these things on it and not send it. There's like no magic here. You could do any of these options. There's often so many different ways to do things when we're mixing, right? SansAmp in combination with your kicks will make a huge difference. If you have two samples, one's a clicky type kick for a nice, so you hear the definition and the character, and the other one's a subby type low end kick. Do a very similar thing. Boost some mid range, gate it if you want to create a slightly different sound, or not because you don't need to because there's no bleed. Send it to a SansAmp track. That's your distortion, and then you can kind of blend that. It's going to add length. Anytime you add distortion, it adds length to the sound. Maybe you need some length. There you go. All right. Now, when it comes to snare, look at what he's doing to the snare drum. I love showing this stuff because, when you get a top guy on the top level who's not afraid to crank, makes me happy. I like to see it. But it's the kid in me that's like, little here, little there is all great until it's not, until we got a crank. So he's cranked up, and, he's literally 13.5 dB at 90 hertz for his snare drum. Pretty cool. You know what I'm saying? -4 dB roughly at 2.4K. Pretty cool. 5.5 dB boost at 1.78K. All right, look at this. Pretty cool. All right. And then over here, 4.17. So he's just at 4.1K, he's boosting 1.5 dB at the end. When I looked at that, I was like, oh, he's got a little something there too. A little something. But it's just a little something. Whereas he's going ham the rest of the time, which I like. Now, over here, he's doing a similar thing where he sends using this, bus 5 in our case, using the pre-fader mode, full on 0.0, sending that right here to snare parallel. Now on here, he doesn't use a SansAmp. What he uses is the same kind of thing he was doing with the gate idea. Okay, so he's gating, leaving the hi-hat out of it if he wants more hi-hat and doesn't want it to sound different because it's being gated. This track down here, the snare parallel, is affected by what's on this track, and this is parallel, so it could be a very little amount. You could decide how much of this you want, right? Now, he's got this on it. This is the original 1176 plugin that came with Pro Tools that a lot of guys still use because it sounds very different than a CLA 76. And you know who's one of the guys who uses it and has talked about it? Serban and John Haynes. So those guys use this. It has a flavor and a sound, and the original Bomb Factory, man, pretty cool. Andrew Sheps has also mentioned this, that it has a different sound. It's like the algorithm kind of works. And maybe they got truer to the algorithm when they created other versions later, but this still has a vibe to it. So don't be afraid to investigate the stock plugins. It's a good tip. 4-to-1, as fast as the release goes, as slow as the attack goes, and the needle was moving about, somewhere in the zone 1176, needles usually move when you're hitting them right. About to there. Boom, boom. About to here, okay? It's like somewhere like -7 dB of gain reduction-ish. Now, I just find most of the time I look at an 1176, that's what it's doing. It's moving. It's not usually like 1 dB. I mean, not most of the time, right? When it's set to 4-to-1 especially. So what else we got? So let's see. So that's the BF76 smushing that thing, and you're bringing that up. Now, again, don't really, the EQ7, see, anytime you see EQs, it's like, especially on a parallel track, just decide if it's hurting you or helping you to add some more EQ to it or some filtering to it in addition to what's already there. And that's how you decide whether that should be there or not. You got to use your ears and go through it. But on his, he had an EQ7 here. So just keeping that in mind, that's why it's here on what I'm explaining. Now, the rack. So on the rack, what he was doing is a similar thing. Gating, because they're real drums, he's always gating. So the same thing with the gating. We don't need to get into that too much. And decapitator on the N mode, which I believe is like a Neve emulation, if I'm not mistaken. That's why they used N. The P is like a Pultec style. And when I say emulation, I just mean they're emulating the way the distortion sounded like when you would crank it. So, and I'm not positive on that. correct me if I'm wrong, but the point is, I believe that's what these letters are for, and that's why the letters are sort of, it's not A, B, C, D. Like, there's a reason this is N. I think it's the Neve style distortion that would happen when you would crank a Neve compared to the Pultec, which is what happens when you crank a Pultec. So that's what the P would be. So in our case, he's got it on the N and just kind of adding a bit of drive to his rack. And look at this EQ. Look at this EQ over here. Boosting 9 dB, centered somewhere around 50 hertz, because he's trying to bring as much low end as he possibly can out of the toms, getting rid of something nasty he didn't like in here, and also cutting out a little bit of 5K. All right. And keep in mind also on his, he's gating as well. So, and now this, he had a duplicate track. I guess he wanted more out of it, because in this case, he did duplicate the rack track, and he had a decapitator on it with the same N setting, and then a Pro Q3 with the same kind of thing going. So I guess he wanted twice as much out of it in a way. It's the only thing I could ponder as to why he would do this. Or maybe he had rack top and rack bottom, perhaps, and that's why he's processing two different tracks. Anything is possible. A lot of this is discerning what people are doing, really, because they don't go into every detail about everything they're doing. So we're forced to use our head and kind of put the puzzle pieces together. All right. He also had some EQ7 bands doing God knows what, because it's not there. He doesn't talk about it. So who knows? And a lot of the time, that's what's going on with these EQs. That's why I say he could be doubling up. He could be putting a little in. Who knows what he's doing, because with some of the EQ7s. He could just be filtering. My gut tells me a lot of times he'll just be filtering when there's like these EQ7s, like they're there for just in case he turned it on to filter something or notch something out he didn't like. Like, that's kind of my gut. They may even live in his template to just be able to do different instances of either notching or filtering or something. So that's what my gut tells me. But the point is, you start doing stuff like this, like just by putting a distortion on your rack, you can really, again, lengthen the sound of the drum, but also kind of add more tone to the drum a lot of times just by adding some distortion. So that's the great thing about Decapitator and the SandSamp plugins and using them in this way. So anyway, I don't want to make this one too long, but tips like this, he's not the only one doing it. Chad Blake does things like this. Chad Blake will have his own SandSamp track. He'll have like an omnipressor on its own track and a distortion on there. Like, he's doing a very similar thing. So if you're wondering why drums sound really good on some of these guys' mixes, it's because they're doing this. So you guys should do this kind of thing too. Try it out at the very least. See if you like it, and leave it in the comments. Questions, answers, throw it in there. I appreciate it. Hit the like button, subscribe. It means a lot. Evan Jaffe, Custom Cut Studios. You guys got this. Take it easy.